In today's video, I will teach you everything that you need to know about tiny painting outside using line and wash, or ink and watercolor. Welcome back, and if you're new here, welcome. My name is Leslie Strohs, and I'm an artist, illustrator, and former university art professor, and I make videos about drawing, painting, and tiny painting. You may have seen some of my tiny painting videos in the past. And today is going to be a master class in tiny painting that will teach you everything you need to know to get started, from what supplies to use, to choosing a location and setting up a pleasing composition, to sketching, inking, and finally painting a tiny painting. And if you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe because it really helps the channel to grow. Let's get started. Line and wash paintings use a combination of ink and watercolor. I'll begin by showing you all of the supplies, including different palettes and setups for painting outside, and different pencil cases and art wraps to carry it all. All of the supplies will be linked in the description. The first thing you'll need is a pencil. I prefer to use mechanical pencils for tiny paintings. The thinner the lead, the better, because it helps prevent smudging. Anything thinner than 0.5 is good, but I prefer 0.3. You can see the difference here. You'll be able to add more details with thinner lead. You can get refills, and it's a good idea to carry a refill with you so you don't run out in the middle of a sketch. I'd recommend a hardness of HB, which will keep the lead thin enough but not too hard that it dents your paper. You'll also want waterproof fine liners. You can use fountain or dip pens, but with tiny paintings, I find that I can get the most precision with a fine liner. Don't use black. It will dominate in a tiny painting and look too heavy. I recommend using a darker brown or a gray color. It will look more natural. Like the pencils, the thinner the better. A 0.05 or 0.1 millimeter work great. My favorites are the Unipin Sepia and the Prismacolor Premier Dark Brown. Any waterproof fine liner will work, so experiment to find which you like best. I like to have 1 or 2 eraser pens with me, like the Pentel Click Eraser or a Tombow Mono. They help to remove masking fluid or lighten colors. A kneaded eraser is also essential for erasing pencil marks and cleaning up your paintings. These will pick up everything they come into contact with, so a container to carry them in is important. I like to find little vintage tins or small clear containers. A few pointed round brushes will do everything you need. I prefer water brushes when I'm painting plein air. As the name implies, you can fill these with water, which eliminates the need to carry an extra water pot. My favorites are the Pentel Aquash brushes. I carry the broad and the fine nibs, but do most of the work with the larger one. If you don't like them, or if you're painting inside, a number 6 or number 4 pointed round brush and a smaller detail brush will do the trick. Next, you'll need some type of palette for your paint. It's not necessary to have a tiny palette, but I personally find them perfect for painting smaller paintings. My favorite is this wooden 8-well palette by GoDraw that attaches to a sketchbook. But I also like this little all-in-one pochette box by Blue Star Crafts, which is great for quick sketches on single sheets of paper. But you don't need anything fancy. You can also make your own palette. For years, I put a few half pans in this tiny tin for travel. I also found this inexpensive student tin and refurbished it with empty makeup pans I filled with paint. I also love the Demi palette by Art Toolkit, which can hold up to 12 colors. There's no one perfect palette. Find the perfect palette for you. For paper, it's helpful to buy the best that you can afford. 100% cotton will give you the best results. Cold-pressed paper has a texture, while hot-pressed paper is smooth. I personally prefer cold-pressed, but experiment to see which you prefer. The thickness or weight of the paper should be at least 140 pounds or 300 grams per square meter. Since you're working small, you can get several paintings out of a single sheet. I cut my own paper to paint on single sheets or to fit into this little pochette box. I can carry a few sheets at a time in this and secure them in place with tiny magnets. You can also purchase or make your own sketchbook. This one is cute, but only has a cellulose or wood pulp paper, and I've struggled with it. The paper doesn't absorb the water very well, and after I've added watercolor, it's difficult to add more ink, so I find it difficult to get good results. This sketchbook by Inkberry, in contrast, has a paper that's 50% cotton, and I've been much happier with the results. When I compare the paintings in the two sketchbooks, I prefer the contrast and sharpness of the one that has a cotton blend paper. If you're using a separate palette, you'll want to have some type of clip to attach it to your sketchbook or drawing board. I love these rubberized chip clips because they have a wide opening and don't dent the paper. I also like these spring clamps because they can reach over palettes with a thicker lid. Binder clips are okay, though I don't like the way they can dent the paper. I also like these brass clips for holding things securely. Next, it's helpful to create a lightweight setup that you can easily hold in one hand, leaving your other hand free to paint. If you're using a sketchbook, you can clip your tiny palette directly to it. If you've seen any of my videos before, you probably already know that this is my favorite setup. It's lightweight, and I can easily break it down into a tiny bundle of creative joy. If you're painting on loose sheets, here are a few different ways you can set things up quickly. I like using a simple clipboard. This little one is perfect. It's about 3.5 by 5 inches. You can clip your paper directly to the board. It will hold a sheet of paper that's 2 by 2 or 2 by 3 inches. Here I'm using the spring clamp to attach my refurbished student palette to the board. It's lightweight and secure, and I can comfortably hold everything in one hand. Or I can rotate things if I'd like to paint in a different direction and hold onto the board or the clip, so there's a lot of versatility with this setup. You can also adapt it to fit any palette. Here's how it looks with my little homemade palette. Even if I move my hand around, the palette stays firmly attached. The demi palette also works great with this configuration because it's so thin and lightweight. These are just a few ideas. You can get quite clever with how you set things up. It's helpful to have a small spray bottle for wetting and re-wetting your palette to keep your paint flowing smoothly. I like to use an athletic wristband to clean my brush. I just wear it on my wrist, and then I don't have to hold a separate cloth. Make sure you're using non-toxic colors if you use this option. All you need to do is squeeze a drop of water through the bristles and wipe it on the wristband to clean them. You can use any brand of paint you prefer, but I would not recommend more than 8 colors for a tiny painting. I like to use a warm and a cool for each of the primary colors, and a few earth colors for convenience. My favorites are transparent red oxide and transparent yellow oxide. You can fill your palette with tubes of paint. After the colors have dried, you can reactivate them with a spritz or drop of water. The top palette is filled with Daniel Smith and the bottom with Winsor & Newton. The manufacturer isn't as important as having 2 of each primary. Here's a color chart showing a sample of some of the colors I can mix with my Daniel Smith palette, and that's by only mixing 2 colors at a time. When I create mixes using 3 or more colors, the sky is the limit. 2 thin knitting needles or shish kebab skewers will help you with measuring. More about that later. I also like to carry some cotton buds or these eye makeup applicators. They're great for removing tiny areas of paint or little mistakes. I keep mine in a little bag I made from parchment paper. A masking fluid pen is also worth its weight in gold for covering areas of paper you want to remain white. You shake it and pump the nib to activate it, and you can later remove it with your eraser pen. And speaking of white, having a way to add it to your paintings helps immensely. Here are 4 different options. The Unipin Posca pen is like a paint marker and is effective at covering. I also like this Milky brush by Pentel, which has a brush nib. The Uniball Signo is more like a ballpoint pen, and so is the Jelly Roll. The coverage on these isn't as good, but they do make thin lines and dots. You can also use white gouache. Here is a sample of the coverage I can get using each of these pens. The yellow strip at the bottom of each square is where I've added watercolor over the white, and the strips on the right of each one shows where I've added water to try to erase the paint. I carry a few scraps of paper for testing colors. And I always have a viewfinder to help me decide on the perfect composition. This view catcher is my favorite because it has markings for different sizes of paper, and the color is the mid-gray of a value scale. I can look through this little hole to isolate colors and determine the different value of them. You can also make your own. Here are a few different viewfinders I've made by cutting various shapes out of corrugated cardboard. And I also like to carry this empty slide to use for my square compositions. It's super portable. Carrying a ruler helps for drawing straight lines or perspective drawings, though you can use your knitting needle or shish kebab skewer for that. This foldable ruler can be super helpful if your scene has a complicated perspective. And a pipette or syringe will help you refill your water brushes. And here is everything all together. My favorite thing about tiny painting is how accessible it makes plein air painting or painting outside. You can carry everything with you in a simple pencil case. These are 3 that I've used the most. This was my very first travel kit, and I used it for years. I loved that it had all of these different compartments inside. It meant that I could easily separate and locate things, and I could even hold a larger palette in this, which I used to do regularly. I'd put all of my little bits in the middle zipped compartment, and then I'd put my dry supplies like pencils, fine liners, and sketchbook in one side, and my wet supplies like aquash brushes, spray bottle, and palette on the other. It was a great setup, and I could easily pop it in my bag or backpack for travel painting. Eventually, I didn't like that I had to constantly dig around to find items, especially for things that I used several times during a painting. So I started using this pencil case by Lihit Lab. Everything had a dedicated place, and I could open it and easily see everything. For tiny painting, this was a game changer. In the first tier, I put all of my drawing and painting supplies, and in the second tier, I put everything else. It meant that when I was painting, I usually only needed to access the first tier, but things could still move around, and I had to keep an eye on my supplies to make sure nothing fell out. I kept my view catcher and business cards in the outside pockets. This was a great solution, and I loved it for a few years. It was also really affordable. A few months ago, I got this art wrap by Peg & All. This one is called the Mini Sendak. It's made of waxed canvas and has 2 deep pockets with sewn compartments above them for pens and pencils, and also a zipped pocket on the side. On the outside are 2 more deep storage pockets. I wasn't sure if I'd like this because I've had art wraps before that didn't impress me, but this is the Rolls-Royce of art wraps, and I'm in love with it. I put the things I use less frequently in the zipped pouch. I keep my sketchbook, palette, and mist bottle in the pockets, and all of my pens, pencils, and brushes in the front. The best part is that nothing falls out of the pockets, which means I don't accidentally lose supplies when I'm painting outside. My art supplies are precious to me, and I don't want to lose any of them. It wraps up into a portable little bundle. I use this mini Sendak as a dedicated tiny painting art wrap for my extra tiny palette and sketchbook. But if I'm completely honest, it's the regular sized Sendak, which is slightly larger. That's my favorite, and the one that I use 90% of the time. The mini Sendak is the streamlined version, but I can keep everything I ever need or want in the larger one, including some extras that I don't usually need, but which are fun to have. The extra pockets on the outside are also great for carrying extra larger sketchbooks and palettes, or extra tiny palettes. Even if you're painting inside, it's really helpful to have a dedicated place to keep your supplies because it eliminates the stress of having to gather supplies every time you want to paint. I'll carry my art wrap around my house or in my garden or to cafes. It's nice to have it with me always because it's essentially my portable art studio. And having a portable art studio with you means you're more likely to paint. And now I'll take you with me and show you how to use all of these supplies to create a tiny painting. The next thing you want to do is go outside and find a nice location to paint. Today I'm staying close to home. I'm up in our secret garden and I'm going to be painting this little tiny house behind me that my husband built with his nephew. It's our little writing and art and music den for the summer or when the weather's nice. And I've painted it before, but it's such a nice location and it will be perfect for today's video. It's currently no-mow May, which means that we don't mow our lawns or do anything for the full month of May to give the bees and the insects time to do their thing. So don't judge the landscaping, just keep your eyes on the building. And let's get started. First of all, you have to decide on your composition, and next to value, composition is one of the most important elements. A few things to avoid are putting your main focal point directly in the center. Find a comfortable vantage point, and I've already decided that if I move too close, it becomes less interesting, and if I'm too far away, I do like the meandering path that goes in front of the cottage. But because the landscaping's overgrown, I really want to try to avoid that. So I think that this is a good vantage point for me to begin my painting. One thing to decide about is whether or not I want this door to be open or closed. So let's take a look at it both ways. You've already seen how it is when it's open. And if I come on up here and close the door, I do think in this instance, even though it's cozy and charming to have the door open, I prefer it closed because of this fennel and the other wildflowers that are coming up over the door. I think that will get too busy if I also have the door open, so I'm going to leave it like that. Next, you take your view catcher, and I'll be working on square paper, so I'll hold it close and look at it through different areas. If I have the cottage directly in the center, it becomes a lot less interesting. In fact, if it's in the center at all, the composition won't be as exciting. So I want it to be a little bit off center. That way it's not as interesting. This way gives me a little more visual interest with some of the different foliage over on the side. I'm thinking something like this might be just about the ticket. I've got the cottage off to the side. I've got some foliage on the right. It's not too dominant. and there are lots of different color greens, and I also see a little bit of these yellow flowers in the lower right-hand corner. So this is my little setup, and because I'm at home, it's a lot more luxurious than it normally is because I have a little chair that came out of the shed, and I have a little table as well. If it's really sunny, it's important and helpful to protect your face and your skin with a hat. And the hat also will help protect the glare of the sun, so it's a really useful item to have in sunny weather. If it's overcast, it's not that important. And one thing that I really like about this art wrap is that I can just drape it over my lap and nothing is going to fall out. So everything is right to hand and it makes it very easy to paint. So I'm relatively hands-free. I'm sitting in my chair now, and I've already established that the framing is going to be something like this. One useful thing to do is to take a picture of your subject matter as soon as you get started. And you want to do this for multiple reasons, mostly because the light is constantly going to be changing as you're painting, and it's always nice to have a reference point to how things were when you first began. And then what I like to do is take that photograph and I'll crop it to the same size as my painting. In this case, it's going to be a square. So I'll make it look how it looked in the viewfinder when I selected the composition, and it's going to be something like that. You can see that the little cottage is slightly off-center, and it's surrounded by lots of different greenery with these patches of blue in the sky. And this line of the walkway is also pointing and leading the eye towards the main focal point, which in this case is the little cottage. And here's the correct way to take measurements using a shish kebab skewer or a knitting needle. You can even use your pen or a paintbrush for this, but I personally like that I'm able to get better details by using something that's a little bit slimmer. So you find a location where you want to stand, and that's the location where you'll stand for measuring everything in your painting. And then you're going to extend your arm as far as it will go. And the reason you want to do that is because if it's a little bit closer or a little bit farther away, it will change the measurements. So by making sure that your arm is always fully extended, you'll be able to check your measurements later and they'll be accurate. Then you place the top of the knitting needle along the top of whatever item it is that you wish to measure, and you'll slide your thumbnail down the shish kebab skewer or knitting needle to the bottom of that object. And you'll do this by closing one eye because that flattens your depth perception and gives you a more accurate measurement. And if you want to be a little bit more accurate, you can slightly tip your head towards the shoulder of the hand that's holding the knitting needle. That will give you the measurement, and then you can turn it different ways to measure it against itself or other items in the scene. In this instance, I'm placing the top of the knitting needle at the peak of the roof and my thumbnail down below the door. And if I turn my hand, I can see that the building is slightly wider than it is high. It's very, very subtle, but it is something that I want to make sure that I'm paying attention to as I'm sketching that building in my sketchbook. The nice thing about this composition is there really isn't a lot of complicated perspective. So we have the best of both worlds. We are able to have some architecture in our scene, but it's not going to be too difficult for us to draw. We'll have a vertical line on the right side of the building, another vertical line on the left, and then all of these other lines in between are also going to be either vertical or horizontal, and they will be parallel to one another. And that also stands true with a little bit of railing over here. There is, however, a tiny bit of one-point perspective in these eaves on the right-hand side and the left-hand side, and this railing that you can see just a little bit of over here. And the way we can determine that is by taking a shish kebab skewer, closing one eye, lining it up with the bottom of the eaves on the right-hand side, and do the same with the left-hand side. And you can see where the point is, which is your vanishing point and which is also eye level. You can actually put that point in, and then when you go to measure these parts, you'll know exactly where they're going to go, and that's true for this bit of the railing as well. The railing that faces us is also going to be horizontal. So set yourself up with a clean page and go ahead and clip it into place so that you are ready to draw. And you'll begin with using your pencil. I'll take the reference photo that I took in the corner so you can see as I do this, but do keep in mind that my vantage point is slightly different, so everything won't line up perfectly. So I've determined by looking through the viewfinder and also my photo that I took that the edge of the building is going to be somewhere around here and will extend about this far over to the left. And I know that I want my peak, which will be in the center, to be somewhere around here. To determine the angle of the peak of the roof, I can use my knitting needle again. I can hold it up along that angle, and as long as the paper or the canvas that I'm painting or drawing on is parallel, that angle will be the same. So I can just transfer that onto the paper here and draw that in. And then I can do the same for the other angle. And I can make any adjustments that need to be made. Now, one thing to note is that this peak is going to be in the center of the building. So I want to make sure that there's an equal amount of distance between the center point and the left side of the building and the center point and the right side of the building. And you can use your knitting needle to do that as well. And that looks perfect. From here, I'll just go ahead and sketch in. So if I measure the width, I know that the base of the door is going to be slightly shorter than this measurement. So it will be probably around there. And from here, I can place in the rest of the items on the building. Now I can measure these angles two different ways. I can do them the same way that I did the peak, where I hold the knitting needle up and determine the angle and then place it down this way. Or I can remember where the vanishing point was, find it again, and I could measure down that way. Whatever way feels more comfortable to you is fine. And this part will all be in shadow. Now I'm just going to sketch in the main forms of the foliage that I see. So I have this bit of fennel and other wildflowers that are growing here. And so I can just put in the whole shape of that, just like so. Then there are also lots of wildflowers extending this way. And behind the tiny house, I see a few big trees that are creating one form behind it and another one over to the left of it where there is a fig tree. So I can just put those in as the shapes that I see. And then over to the right, I see some foliage of different values, so I'm going to put in those shapes as well. I see a lighter one right here of the apple tree in the neighbor's garden. That's slightly to the right of the building. Then there are some more weeds and wildflowers growing over here. And in the far distance are some other trees that I can't see much of, but I can just give a nod to those with some various shapes to indicate where those are. And that's as much as I need to get going. And now I'm going to start by taking the same drawing and inking it. And to ink the painting, I'll be using my Unipin 0.1 sepia fine liner. The trick for this is to go over the lines that you've already indicated and also add texture in areas where you see it. So if you see a certain pattern of something, go ahead and put that in at this stage of the game. You also want to be a lot more light-handed with this than you think that you do. Another thing to note is that you always want to be looking at the subject matter through all of these stages. Don't trust your drawing. The purpose of being outside and drawing is to be looking at your subject matter because you're going to learn a lot from doing that. Oftentimes for these finer details, I will set the sketchbook or paper down to make sure that my lines aren't too shaky. Although a little bit of shakiness is actually fine and makes it look more authentic and realistic. Notice that I'm not holding the pen in a death grip very close to the point. I'm actually keeping my fingers more relaxed and holding them further back. And that's actually going to give you more control, and it's also going to make your lines look more characterful and more artistic and painterly. So you'll have more interesting marks by being a little bit looser on the pen. Before I proceed with sketching in all of the foliage, I want to take a good hard look at my scene and see if I see any values that I want to be preserved as white. In this case, that's a little bit in this window at the top of the house and some of these yellow flowers that I can see blooming in front of the house. They're difficult to see on camera, but in reality, I can see a big cluster here and here. So I want to make sure that I leave some areas of the paper white so that I can go in with that yellow later. There is also some foliage going over the cottage, and I think I want to block that in so that when I paint the brown colors, I don't have to be worried about going around all of these items. And for that today, I'm going to take the Molotow marker, shake it up, and sketch in those areas. And once that's had time to dry, I'll go ahead and I'll finish inking the rest of the painting. I'm not only going to put in trunks or branches or key things, but I'm also going to be looking for relative pattern in each of the areas of foliage, and that's going to make it look a little more distinctive. Drawing foliage can be intimidating if you've never done it before. So here are a few easy tips to help you get started and to overcome any of those fears and be a bit more brave and bold about it. It helps to differentiate different sections from one another. So in this painting, I have the foreground, which consists mainly of lots of wildflowers and long grasses. And in this case, they tend to be directional, so they're leaning more towards the right. So I keep that in mind as I'm drawing. I look for one or two distinctive areas, maybe a leaf here or a flower here, and I'll put in one or two of those shapes. But for the most part, I'm just looking for different patches of value. So if there's an area in one section that's a bit darker, I'll darken that area. And then for the other areas, I'm remembering those directional lines and always trying to make my marks coincide with those directions. And that's something that I'm going to do for each section. I'll look for various shapes of darker value, and those are almost always going to be an organic shape. So it's not going to be a circle or a square or a triangle. It's going to be something that's a bit more amorphous. And then for the other areas that are lighter or a mid-value, I'm thinking about the relative pattern of each section and putting in lines to coincide with that. And those different textures not only help to delineate one area from another, but they also add more visual interest. And then the second thing that I do is I'm always remembering atmospheric perspective. And the way that that works is that objects that are closer to you tend to be darker and have more contrast. And that includes contrast in color, but it also includes contrast in value. So you're going to see more of an extreme difference between the lightest lights and the darkest darks. And then as things get further away, like the trees in the distance, the lines will be a little bit lighter and the areas of contrast won't be as extreme. It's important whenever you're drawing or painting something to make sure that you're looking at the subject matter very closely. The rules of atmospheric perspective, that objects that are closer are usually darker and warmer, aren't always that easily visible in a given scene. And they're not always true. This is one of the things about painting that makes it something you can do for a lifetime and continue to learn new things. In this scene, for example, the trees behind the tiny house are very definitely darker in color than the grasses in the foreground. And of course, I want to put in exactly what I see, but I'm remembering the rules of atmospheric perspective as I'm looking at those trees. And I'm noticing that the areas of contrast between the different colors is much more subtle than in the foreground. And the green colors are also bluer in comparison to the grasses in the foreground. For this large tree or cluster of trees behind the tiny house, I'm looking at the main shapes of the leaves. So I can see that there's a shape back here, and that's going to be one relative color. So I'm just going to block that in as I see it. Then there's some shading behind there with some sunlight showing, so I don't want it to be too solid. So I'm just going to pop in the area where those shadows are. And then there are some more clusters of lighter green. There's a branch. And I'm just paying attention to these main areas. There's a little bit of texture in there. And I'm popping those in with some directional lines and some marks to give the illusion of these big clusters of leaves. And the more you do at this stage of the game, the better off you'll be in the long run. So I'm mainly looking for the main shadow shapes, and I'm trying to leave the areas where the brighter green of the leaves will be. If you've added masking fluid like I have here, it's a helpful thing to remember that you want to have some contrast around where you've put the masking fluid. Otherwise, it won't be as distinctive. So I'll make sure I do that with both the ink and also the paint. One other thing I want to mention is that I made the decision for this video to show you things mostly in real time. There are a few areas where things are ever so slightly sped up, and I've edited out some of the times where I'm pausing and staring and so forth. But there are timestamps in the description of the video, so if you want to skip around or skip a section altogether, you can do that more easily. I'll pop in a few more directional lines here in the walkway. And now we're ready to paint. I'll put on my wristband for the paint and attach my palette to the sketchbook. And then I'll pre-wet my colors. I'll start with some of the blue of the sky, and for that I'm going to use a little bit of ultramarine with just a dash of the transparent red oxide to make it a little less blue. It's a bit overcast today. And I'll just dot that in. It's very subtle, but it is there. And I see lots of it behind these leaves as well. And then into that, I'll add a little bit of the Hansa yellow light. And I'll block in the greens of the distant trees. For the grayish-brown color of the little cottage, I'm going to use some French ultramarine and transparent red oxide and mix up a gray that looks very similar. And I'll start with a light wash of that. And I've added a bit more of the transparent red oxide for some of the areas that have a bit more red in them. And I'm using the tip of my brush for those areas. And then I'll make a grayer mix again by adding some more of the French ultramarine, and I'll dot some of that into some of these areas. And also under the eaves where there are the most shadows. And I just go back and forth a bit, adding a bit more color as I see it. Now there are some shadows in the panes of glass on the bottom half of the door from whatever is behind me. And that is a bit bluer. So I'll add a bit more blue to that area and block in where I see those main reflections. And from experience, I know that adding a little bit of transparent yellow oxide or raw sienna, if you have that, is going to make it look a bit more like what I'm actually seeing. The area on top is a lot more pale and has a bit of yellow in it. So I'll add a bit of the new gamboge. And block that in very lightly. Clean your brush off in between colors. And I want to darken that shadow a little bit. There's a bit of terracotta color of the pot over here and again over here, so I want to put that in. I'll use some transparent red oxide with just a dash of the new gamboge. I can see that peeking behind the foliage here and again over here. And whenever I have a color that seems to be unique to the scene, I'll look around and see where else I can see little dots of that same color, and that's going to make the painting have more harmony. I'll use a bit of the phthalo blue and the Hansa yellow light. That gets me a very bright green, similar to the greens that I see up front, but that is much too acidic, so to tone it down a little bit, I'll add a dash of the transparent red oxide. And then I'll block in some of these lighter values that I see in the front. You always start with the lighter values, and you can go in and layer the darker values later on top. Now I'll take a bit of the phthalo and some of the transparent yellow oxide that I see in some of these areas. The sun is playing a bit of peekaboo, and when I do see it come out, some sunlight hits strategic areas of the building. So I'm going to use that to my advantage and take a little bit of the new gamboge and layer that onto those areas where the sunlight kisses the building. You always have to be careful to not do what they call chasing the light, meaning you don't want to change the lighting in your picture every 5 minutes. You want to stick more or less with what you see and then go with that. But I do like the idea of having a few warmer areas here. And then again, taking the burnt sienna, a bit of the French ultramarine, and going in with a second and even a third coat in some of these other areas. Into that mix, I'm going to put a little bit of New Gamboge and some more French ultramarine. And that's going to give me some of these darks that I'm seeing here in the trees behind the cottage. You want to squint your eyes when you're looking for these main shadow shapes. And that's going to help them reveal themselves to you. I'm going to take a little bit more of the Hansa Yellow Light and New Gamboge to create a medium value for some of the areas between the light and the dark, and I'll just pop those in. For this very pale green that I see right next to the cottage in the background, I'm going to add just a touch of the transparent red oxide with the tiniest bit of phthalo blue. And if I keep that watery, it will be a nice light color that mimics what I see. And I see some of that color back here as well. I'm losing my light and I'm afraid it's going to start to rain, but I want to add some more color to my composition, and this is the stage where I'll do that. I've got all my main shapes in and my main colors, but now I want to brighten things and add a bit more vibrancy. And that's why the second and third coats are always the most fun. So I'm going to start by adding some more reds to the cottage, and I'll use the transparent red oxide and a bit of the ultramarine, the same two colors I've been using, and dot some of that in where I see it, mostly along the woodwork of the doors and the windows. Then I'll add some more of the vibrant colors, using a bit of the French ultramarine and the Hansa Yellow Light to some of these trees behind the cottage. And then a bit more of the phthalo blue and the Hansa Yellow Light. Toned down with a bit of the transparent red oxide for some of the foliage in the foreground. There's always more contrast for the items that are closer to you, and the colors are also warmer and brighter than they will be generally as they recede into the distance. I'll give all these colors a second to dry, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to add a little bit of ink to some of the areas on the cottage to bring out a little bit more of the definition that got lost in the painting process. I want to be very careful to not be too outliney here. I just want to look for the edges that are the sharpest and put in one or two strategic lines to help that building come forward out of the landscape. So there's a line there. I want to sharpen this corner. At this stage of the game, I'll take my pen eraser and I will erase all of the masking fluid. And you want to be very careful with this and be slow because you don't want to rip any of the paper. It's always so exciting to reveal the white of the paper again, and it really helps bring out the darker values and the mid values as well. It's starting to rain a little bit now, but that's actually very realistic for a situation when you're painting outside. The weather's constantly changing. So I'm going to add a few areas of brightness over here. I'll use the Hansa yellow light, and I've been picking up some blue on that paint cake. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that in, because it's already a bit greened down for me. I see that over here. I'll pop some of that very pale, lighter value in where I see it. Add a bit of the transparent yellow oxide for some of these. And then I'll use a mix of both of my yellows for these little flowers that I see. And I'm putting them in a little bit more pronounced than I see them because I feel that this composition would benefit from that. And again, you want to spread the love. So if I see a color in one area, I'll put it someplace else. And I can even add a bit to some areas of the cottage back here in some of these windows. See a little bit of that over here. So at this stage of the game, I'm just finessing. So I'm going to take a little bit more of this terracotta color where I see these glimpses of pots in the distance. Put some of that in. Add a bit more of that to the cottage as well, just to make it a little bit more lively. Add some more darks to the shadow areas. There's the tiniest dash of a red here in the window. So again, I'll spread the love and see where else I see that color on the woodwork, and a little bit in some of the stray weeds. And I'll go behind and add just a few dots of where the cottage is behind the fennel here. And then again over here as well. And I'll add a bit more ink to where this fennel is, just to emphasize some of the stalks. I don't want to do too much here, just a very little bit. If I wanted to add a few details, if I felt like I had become too dark in certain areas, I could go in with the white pen and I could add some of those areas. I don't think I really need it in this painting, to be honest, but I will add a little bit of white around this window as well as a few of the stalks just to show you what that would look like. And for that, I'm going to use the Milky brush. So I'll put in a few lines. Maybe I want to lighten this post. And I think that's pretty good. After that's dry, I can go in and define any areas around that. And if you remember from our little sheet earlier, I can also add a bit of color on top of it. So for instance, if I want to pick up some of these stalks and make them a bit more green, I can mix up a green and place that directly on top of the white, just like that. Just add my last few finishing touches, and that will be it. So there's our final painting, and there it is next to the subject matter. And we finished just in time because if you can see the rain clouds behind me, we are about to be officially rained out. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this video has been helpful for you and that you feel more equipped to go on some tiny painting adventures of your own. If you've liked this video, consider checking out my Patreon, where I have similar videos with tiny painting, drawing, and watercolor. Or you can check out my website, where I will be offering bundles of narrated tiny paintings similar to today's video. If you'd like some more tips about painting outside, you can check this video right here. Or if you'd like to see more about different tiny palettes, you can check this video. And for some more tiny painting tips, you can check this video. I hope you all have a beautiful day. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video.